Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday afternoon with us. And before I proceed, I'd like to give a shout out to our first set of audience who commented right away on this live post. So we have Sar, Miss Lulu, Delphine Ignacio, and Zyril and Napaon. Thank you so much. Thank you. Third installment of the class lecture series. Today's event is held in cooperation with the University of Santo Tomas Unitas Journal, which is headed by Editor-in-Chief Dr. Maria Luisa Torres Reyes, who is also the Editor Emerita of the Ateneo de Manila's Critica Cultura Journal. The class lecture series is primarily geared toward developing up-to-date, flexible, and relevant ways of teaching a range of subjects offered in the Commission on Higher Education approved new AB Literature curriculum. In the context of the teaching and learning limitations imposed by the quite prolonged COVID pandemic, topics of the online lectures range from new curricular content to the pedagogy in the classroom delivery of the syllabus. Colleagues who are esteemed experts in their particular fields have agreed to be part of the series, covering topics in mandated subjects such as cultural studies, creative writing, critical theory, literature content courses, and the use of technology in the classroom or classnet setting, among others. Guest speakers have been requested to share their ideas and experience in teaching particular subjects in relation to the syllabus, pedagogy, teaching tools, and classroom techniques that they use, focusing on any of your best practices. A question and answer portion will follow the lecture with the audience, so you may key in your questions in the comment section later. Today's installment of the class lecture series is about teaching law and literature, poetic encounters with law. The abstract reads, a course in law and literature uses literary texts that emphasize legal themes or dilemmas. This lecture offers options and directions for teaching the course through a reading of the following poems: Emily Dickinson's I Read My Sentence Steadily, Ted Hooser's The Witness, Eduardo Corral's excerpt from Border Triptych, and Alfredo Navarro Salanga's 21st August 1986. Each of these poems present different encounters with law, shown through persona, dramatic situation, and imagery. Lastly, the lecture explores the possibility of using Philippine literature of protest to start building a Philippine law and literature canon. This afternoon's speaker is Mr. Francis Sollano, MA. He is an instructor in the Department of English, Ateneo de Manila University. He is also a PhD candidate in La Trobe University. His dissertation project examines on the role of the public sphere in the 1986 Philippine Constitution making. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome our esteemed speaker, Mr. Francis Sollano.
Good afternoon, everyone. This presentation is on teaching law and literature, poetic encounters with law. Before I start, I would like to thank UNITAS and class for hosting this lecture series and providing this venue to share my experience in teaching law and literature and my thoughts on possible directions of the field in the Philippine context. I am also grateful to my home institutions, to Ateneo, for giving me the opportunity to develop a law and lit course in 2015 and to teach it in the succeeding years, and to La Trobe University, where I am writing a dissertation project under the scope of law and lit. As always, I am excited to initiate a dialogue about this topic, so I look forward to your questions and insights later. And feel free to send me an email regarding related concerns and even possible future collaborations. The texts of the poems are in Google Drive, and I thank class and Unitas team for setting that up. And they will share the link probably in the chat if you're in Zoom or in ways that are doable. Okay. The outline. Let me. Okay. The outline of the lecture is as follows. First, I will provide a very quick introduction to law and literature and its subfield, law in literature. Then I will briefly point out some general considerations when designing a syllabus or a lesson. The main discussion will focus on possible class activities using 4 poems. Emily Dickinson's I Read My Sentence Steadily, Ted Kooser's The Witness, Eduardo Corral's excerpt from Border Triptych, and Alfredo Navarro Salanga's 21 August 1986. These are lyric poems in which law is highlighted in the lived experience of the personas and through the dramatic situation and other elements of the poems. Lastly, I will make a case for developing a canon for law in literature in the Philippines using the literature of protest in the Philippines as a jumping point. Law and literature is the umbrella term for the scholarly field and movement that connects the 2 disciplines. There are various historical and disciplinal developments that prompted the formalization of this field in the 1960s and the 1970s, such as the attempts of the disciplines to be more relevant in their own terms, the general development of the interdisciplinary movement, and the intuitive connection between law and literature. If we are to systematize the scholarship of the field, we will encounter these main strands. First is the distinction between law in literature and law as literature. The main difference is the object of study. The first studies literary texts, and the latter deals with legal texts, such as court cases, decisions, statutes, the Constitution, and others, while using literary theory. Second is the development of what Julie Stone Peters calls hermeneutics, which is the interaction between literary theory and legal science, and narrative, the use of storytelling to humanize the legal practice. Last is the acknowledgement that laws affect the production, distribution, and consumption of literature, such as in copyright laws, in censorship, and in others. At this point, I will reiterate an argument that I have mentioned in previous discussions, that although the ideal scenario is for the teacher in a law and lit class to have expertise in both disciplines, law and literature, or alternatively, for a class in law and lit to be team taught by separate experts, again in both disciplines, the optimal situation for most of us teachers and institutions is to start in law in literature. That's why I highlighted it in red, because I think this is a starting point, especially for our situation in Philippine education. This means that we start with our home discipline, literature, and focus on the study of literary texts with legal themes and insights. In this way, the teaching of the course is more grounded and less daunting. Of course, there's also space to developing the other strands, but that will take more time and effort at this point for us and for our institutions. Allow me to mention these quick notes for those who are planning to design a course in law and lit. Broad strokes from my experience of teaching it. For those who are already teaching the course, I look forward to hearing about your experience also later in the open forum. The most important factor for me is where the students are coming from and what has been their exposure to literature already. Clearly, handling a class of lit majors would be different from a class of pre-law majors that had no literature prerequisites. This is related to the second point, which is seeing the course in relation to the entire curriculum design of your institution. For example, does your institution require general literature subjects and how many units or other relevant or related subjects to literature? Third, as already mentioned, it is necessary to set the student's expectation that the subject is a lit course. The course will help them in law school, if that is their intention, by preparing them to pay close attention and be critical of what they are reading, and by making them think about the law's function and spirit. The most challenging part of preparing a syllabus for me is the selection of texts that has the right balance of genre, if that is important for you, and legal themes to discuss. So an important factor also is access to these texts and to teacherly and scholarly materials as well. There are a lot of works in law and lit. I will share just two books that provide a set of materials. One is Teaching Law and Literature, published by the Modern Language Association. And second, Poetry of the Law, published by Iowa University Press, where 3 of the poems in today's lecture are also collected. There are others, and in fact, there are many, but most of them are theoretical. And there is another problem with most of these, if not all of these collections, which I will return to later. Now I will go to the suggested class activities. I will emphasize at the outset that these are only suggestions that can be tweaked depending on the considerations I mentioned earlier and other class dynamics. I recommend that prior to the discussion of these texts, these poems and others, to have a relevant pre-reading activity. The pre-reading activity warms up the students to the ideas and insights that will be discussed. A short class sharing or group discussion will do. In this set of poems, my objective is for students to understand the relationship or their encounter with law as will be presented in cases in the poems. This exercise is not usual for us because most of us go with our everyday lives without being conscious about law. In this pre-reading discussion, I want the students to put law, even for a while, in the foreground. My first main question is, how do they imagine law? The verb imagine can be transposed with other modes of encountering, such as understanding or feeling. And a good sub-question would be, what figures or metaphors can be used to be described to describe the law as that appeals to them, to the students. At this point of the activity, law can be defined First, in the most general way possible, that is, rules and regulations that guide our conduct and behavior. And later, it can be narrowed down to its more formal definition, that is, a system of rules that is promulgated by a legitimate authority, such as the state. Another question that can be explored in the pre-reading activity is how the students imagine their relationship with law. And a contextualizing question would be, when was the last time that they had a relevant encounter with law? The point of these guide questions is to make students think about their varying and changing relationships with the law. Do they find it overbearing that sometimes they had to escape it? Do they find it a nuisance? Like when was the last time that we really read, for example, the license agreements in the apps that we install? And yet, why do we feel secure, confident, and more trusting? Because we feel that there is a law that governs us and that it applies to everybody. The role of the teacher, of course, in the pre-reading activity and in the discussions is to facilitate this flow of ideas and experiences. It would be more efficient if the class is assigned to close read the poem as an assignment, and to guarantee that they read the poem closely, a group discussion can be arranged. 4 groups for the 4 poems, and each group assigned to focus on a poem whose discussion they will lead in class. As we know, a basic to close reading is attention to the literary elements. And because the poems are law and literature texts, close reading also entails highlighting the encounters with law presented in the texts. Take note that the groups are individually assigned to a poem to focus, is individually assigned a poem to focus on, but all groups are to discuss all 4 poems so that they can contribute in discussing any poem in class. As part of the assigned group discussion, the class is also instructed that the groups will lead a short discussion of the poem assigned to them. Discussion leadership is different from and is more challenging compared to reporting, because the group is not only to present their reading or to report the reading, but rather to lead the class toward a reading of the text. This means that the group, after discussing their interpretation of the poem, should prepare guide questions or possibly even activities to ask their classmates or to facilitate an arrival toward the reading or an interpretation of the text. It is advisable for the teacher to get a sense of the general interpretation and plan of the groups prior to the discussion leadership sessions. The teacher directs the process and provides closing discussions of the poem. So with that, I will go to the poems. I will start with Dickinson's poem. The sequence of the poems may vary, but here I start with Dickinson's poem. I read my sentences steadily because it is written the earliest. Again, please refer, or you can go online. You can see a copy of the poem online. Allow me to read the poem. I read my sentence steadily, reviewed it with my eyes to see that I made no mistake in its extremest clause, the date and manner of the shame, and then the pious form that God have mercy on the soul. The jury voted him. I made my soul familiar with her extremity, that at the last it should not be a novel agony, but she and death acquainted, meet tranquilly as friends, salute and pass without a hint, and there the matter ends. The first difficulty to entangle or disentangle in this poem is the presence of multiple, even simultaneous personas. Who is speaking? The most probable answer is the accused, reading the sentences that has been handed down to him. But it can also be the judge, right? Checking that the sentence is in order. But that, however, that it is the lawyer or even a bystander reading about a controversial case in the papers, these are also defensible readings of the poem. The multivocality, the many voices in the poem is emphasized by the jagged lines broken by the dashes and presenting this paradox, and this presents a paradox that the persona is supposed to be reading a sentence steadily. So we see the poem broken, the lines broken and jagged, but the persona is supposed to be reading these sentences steadily and careful at the formal elements of the sentence, the manner, the date, the crime or the shame, and the formulaic piety of may God have mercy on your soul. There are also shifts in the personal pronouns, first to third person, male to female. And all of these seeming confusions happening in the poem is concluded by the magisterial sounding last line. And there the matter ends. What can we make out of this poem? First is that it mimics the legal heteroglossia and the noise and cacophony of voices in a courthouse. It is interesting that Emily Dickinson is the daughter of a lawyer, so she is not unfamiliar with this scenario. Voices overlap each other in court accounts, in testimonies, and even in the passing of judgment. Whose voice is it who convicts? Is it the state, the jury, the judge, or is it the convicted themselves, convinced by their own guilt, their own shame? The shift in personal pronouns copies also the shock of that the sentence forces upon those who is reading it, but especially to the accused. And so it forces, the sentence forces them to hold themselves at a distance in third person or even as a different person. To objectify the criminal is really what the law does to some extent. Someone who is accused is just the defendant. So the poem makes us ask this question. What happens when one encounters the full force of the law? Its extremist clause, as mentioned in the poem. The second poem is by Ted Kooser, The Witness. The divorce judge has asked for a witness, and you wait at the back of the courtroom, as still as a flag on its stand, your best dress falling in smooth, even folds that begin now to gather the dust of white bouquets, which like a veil of lace is lifting away from the kiss of the sunlit windows. In your lap, where you left them, your hands lie fallen apart like the rinds of a fruit. Whatever they cupped has been eaten away. Beyond you, across a lake of light, where years have sunk and settled to the floor, the voices drone on with the hollow sound of boats robbing a dock that they're tied to. You know what to say when they call you. The dramatic situation of the poem show a witness presently waiting for a divorce hearing in a courthouse back room. But it is a very boring moment, with the witness hearing the droning voices in the other room. As the scene is described, images associated with marriage is shown. The best dress, the even folds, white bouquets, veil of lace, the kiss. And so we sense the loss, the passage of time, and the relationship growing distant from the event of the marriage in the past to the present event. Like the rind of the fruit, what has been cupped by those hands has already been eaten away. But the poem ends with a future certainty, certain to the witness, but not to us, not to the readers. Legal proceedings, the legal proceeding in the poem uh, brackets two events from the beginning to the end. The story that the poem presents starts with the present but goes to the past. As the poem presents a legal trial for a divorce, it goes back to another legal proceeding, the marriage. It is weird and unromantic to see marriages in this way, but it is what it is. Bared of its romantic trappings, a marriage is a contract regulated by the state. It is to have two parties entering into a contract with a solemnizing officer representing the state. So, from the most formal and boring events, like waiting for a trial to start, to the most special and memorable ones, like marriage, all of these are suffused by law. However, and here we see the human component of the law in the poem, in the end, it is the witness, only herself and no one else, not the judge, who can stand there with certainty, speak what she wants to say, because it is her who experienced those years, that loss, that distance, and no one else. From a somewhat sad poem, we go to a comical poem written by Eduardo Corral. Border Triptych is composed of 3 poems, and this is one of them, one of the triptych. Sapo and I wait for the cool of night under mesquite. 3 days in the desert, and we're still too close to Mexico. Still so far from God. Sapo's lips so dry, he swabs the pus licking from the ampollas on his toes across his mouth. I flip a peso. Heads, we continue. Tails, we walk toward the highway, thumb our way to Nogales. The peso disappears into a nest. but the hard-on in Sapo's jeans, slightly curved, points west. I catch a cascabel, strip off its meat. Sapo mutters, "Noke no gay." I bury its forked tongue. For one night, our names won't flower in the devil's throat. We're Indios, but no gringos will mistake us for Navajos. Above us, an owl grins like Cantinflas. The arms of the saguaros strike down the hours, but the sun refuses to set. Sapo shits behind a cluster of nopales and shouts our favorite joke, "No tengo papeles." The dramatic situation of the poem has a clear narrative. Sapo and the persona are trying to cross the US border by crossing the desert. It is so difficult that they are having thoughts to just go back to Nogales, and they flip a coin to decide their next step. However, they lose the coin, and so their fate was decided instead by the hard-on Sapo's jeans, and them making do whatever the desert affords them. The poem ends with Sapo shitting behind some bushes and shouting their favorite joke, "They have no papers." The poem is also unique for its use of unfamiliar terms, pop culture, different language registers with the English language, and its playful rendition of the sonnet form. It is necessary for the students, therefore, to first unlock these unfamiliar terms for them to know the sonnet form before they can unlock and understand what the poet is trying to do here. Again, the poem is clearly comical, even irreverent throughout. The irreverence of the poem is clinched by the line, "No tengo papeles." They don't have tissue paper. But as illegal migrants, they also don't have immigration papers. Or better yet, they do not need those immigration papers. Those immigration papers are only as good for them to wipe their behinds with. In that desert, Sapo and the persona are outlaws. They hide from the law. They do not obey it. Their disobedience is also shown in the form and the language of the poem, in the way the sonnet form, arguably the most familiar of the classic Western poetic forms, is broken, and the mixture of the unfamiliar references in the English language, the language used in those immigration forms and other legal documents that they need. The last poem in the collection is this poem by Alfredo Navarro Salanga, titled 21 August 1986. Going into the fort, he imagines the gates yawning wide. It is nearing siesta time. His guard tells him as he bends over slightly to scratch his groin. The gatekeeper motions them to hurry, his mouth open in a yawn that prefaces what his officers have bidden him do. Ah, the insurrecto. He grins as he too bends over slightly to plunge key into lock. The prisoner imagines all that bowing must be acts of some strange obeisance and insists on telling them his truth. "You have my body," he says, "but I will neither yawn nor scratch." "So be it," says the first guard as he bends over slightly to scratch his groin. "So be it," echoes the gatekeeper as he bends over slightly to plunge key into lock. In the quiet dark of his cell, his hand reaches up to touch the crown of his hair. The heat of the noonday sun is still with me, he murmurs softly, as he imagines his guards yawning themselves to slumber. They have their bodies to contend with, he says, his words plunging hard like keys into locks, the gates in his mind flung open, the passage made wide as a mouth opened in laughter, triumphal. This poem is published in Veritas on August 21, 1986, hence the title, in an issue dedicated to the first death anniversary of Ninoy Aquino after the fall of the dictatorship. By this time, the Philippines is already drafting its new constitution under the Aquino government. But the poem also includes a note of reference to a certain Fidel Villaruel, a common Katipunero, who was imprisoned in Fort Bonifacio because the Katipunan had been discovered. Here, we have an insurrecto going to prison and encountering his guard and gatekeeper, who do repetitious and boorish actions, yawning, scratching of the groin. In his dark cell, the prisoner escapes, but through his mind, he flings open the gates of his mind and feels triumphal even when he is in prison. Insurrection or rebellion can be considered as the most serious of crimes, tantamount to attempting to murder the king, which results in the gruesome first stages of Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And in modern law is a reason for martial law or a state of emergency, a state of exception. However, it is also a crime with the most sacred of reasons, such as sometimes freedom and self-determination. The insurrecto believes, and in many cases this is warranted, that he has the right to rebel, to disobey, and to even destabilize the current system. The guard and the gatekeeper are extensions of the coarse, unjust laws, extensions of the executive and executory power, as the guard and the gatekeeper are executioners of the law. The prisoner knows that as minions of the system, they won't understand what he is fighting for. So he retreats to his mind and, like Sisyphus, savors it triumphantly. The main point of the discussions in the discussion leadership and in the closing discussion of the teacher is to emphasize that these different situations make encountering with the law inevitable, evident, and powerful. Yeah, these are what we have encountered. The persons here are criminals surrendering, yielding to an extreme judgment, outlaws trying to short circuit the law, people who want to believe that the current legal regime is not for them, or someone seeking a legal remedy for a lost relationship, all showing how complex the law is when it is encountered by real persons. My last point talks about the canon. And the term canon is a very controversial one. In fact, we can say that we are already past the era of questioning the canon or the era of counter canons, etc. But what I want to say is simply this, that there is no such development yet in law and literature in the Philippines. An interesting trivia is that, in fact, in the early years of the UP College of Law, there's already a law and literature subject. Yeah, you will see here in the UP College of Law General Catalog 1932 to 1933 that there is a law and literature reading course, and it is described as law reform and the development of the law by the great novelists. So if you can, if you will check, we will find familiar canonical names, Hugo, Dickens, Hawthorne, and the only Filipino listed here is Rizal, and the English the Charles Derbyshire translation of Rizal's novel, Social Cancer. Yeah, and of course, in the current law school system, there's no longer a place for such a course in the law school. So what we're doing is that we're offering a similar course in the undergraduate level. However, as we can see in the selection of materials, all of these are Western centric um, uh, works. Yeah, so we already know the problem in canon formation of how collections and scholarship are Western centric. However, in a law and literature class, the problem is doubled because not only are we presenting Western centric literature texts, we are also presenting a legal system or legal systems with Western assumptions. Yeah. So and sometimes or most of the time that is not applicable with how law is experienced in the Philippines. Jennifer Franco, for example, has already highlighted how in the Philippines there are many languages of the law, or there is what she calls a plural legal landscape. So sometimes we have religious law, guerrilla law, especially in rural areas, a barangay justice system. We are familiar with the Filipino phrase, sa barangay ka na magpaliwanag, or sa barangay, magreklamo ka sa barangay, so on and so forth. And that is all caused by the weakness of state law in the country. And my idea, and of course this has to be explored further, probably in a different venue, is we can start. I realize that we can start with protest literature in the Philippines. In the Google Drive that I hope you can access, there's this poem by Dylan Thomas titled "The Hand That Signed the Paper," and well, from the title itself, we can glean that it's a poem about totalitarian power and it uses the hand as a synecdoche to represent that unfeeling power. The hands have no tears, so on and so forth. So it's or in itself, it is already an interesting representation of totalitarian power. But how much more if we are to put that in the Philippine context, in the Philippine experience? And so I invite you to compare that with another poem written by R. Torres Pandan titled The Tyrant. So you will see there phrases or images that will only echo if we are familiar with the Philippine experience. Assailed by decree, dim and dungeon, impales our limbs, impounds the word in his palace, behind a historian's mask. So, and so reading the poem, it makes us ask, what are the laws that created this tyrant? And we go back, right? We go back from the declaration of martial law, the Proclamation 1081, to the amendments, the 1976 amendments to the 1973 Constitution, giving the executive legislative power. And in fact, more recently, during Gloria Arroyo's time, the Presidential Proclamation 1017. Again, similar to the declaration of martial law. So I'm just presenting this to you because I know that many, if not most of you are teachers. An invitation for us to start collate law and literature materials. Yeah, and so it's called to go to the archives. And I think, and again, this is my my take from my experience of doing my own archival work right now as a PhD student. The Philippine protest literature is a good place to start. Yeah. And so that's it. These are, aside from the poems, these are the materials that I consulted. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much, Sir Sollano, for that very insightful discussion on law and literature. I particularly like, well, aside from the unpacking of the representations of law in the selected poems that we discussed, I particularly like the discussion on the distinction among literature as law, literature of law of literature, uh, law and literature, law in literature, and law as literature. Um, I would like to acknowledge our viewers from Ilocos Sur, from our colleagues from the UST, and definitely our friends from UP Manila and Nueva Vizcaya State University. Thank you so much for tuning in. So we now proceed to the open forum. You may key in your questions. I think one of the questions in the comment section a while ago is if they could access not only the reading materials that you have shown us, but particularly the books, the sample books that you have presented. So, sir, is it possible that we can access it, or is it paywall?
Yeah, that's again a problem of access. No, and now that we are, of course, there's this whole move to be interdisciplinary. So the adjustment not only comes from us but also from our institutions. So really a challenge here is also for our institutions to grant us those access. I'm the books that I showed are books that I used because I requested our library, the Rizal Library, to purchase them and have them available in the library. Otherwise, uh, again, I don't know whether they are available online or probably parts of them are available online. I know the book from published by University of Iowa is available in Google Books, but only in certain parts. So you can check the
Certain pages are only available.
poems there. But again, I think we have to force, if that's necessary, for our institutions to help us. Yeah, being interdisciplinary is hard enough, like retraining, so on and so forth. So we need all the support also from our institutions.
Especially with our digital library, from the
Right, right.
universities where we are affiliated to. Sir, there's one question from one of the teachers from Visayas. So it says, what is the most exciting discussion you had in class ever? On what topic and what text?
Right. Thank you for that question. In a previous presentation, I don't know if that's available, but I think it's hosted by Shed. I talked about the story by Albert Camus. Now I forget the or the title is The Host. So it's one of the short stories by Albert Camus. And the poems that I chose here, in fact, I chose them because I think in my experience, had I had a productive response from my students. Of course, there are longer works that I suggest you take a look into. For novels, for plays, many of Shakespeare's plays, in fact, have a legal dimension. For example, Merchant in Venice. We can take a look at the classic play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. Yeah, Oedipus Rex. You have there the king, the criminal, wedged into one character. Uh, Antigone, right? She had this dilemma of whether to follow the law of the state or her familial obligation to bury her brother. Yeah, these are what I'm saying is that these are classic texts because they hark back to, in fact, very human dilemmas, very human questions. Yeah, and I think that's the excitement in general with law in literature. We usually don't think about law, right? We proceed with our everyday lives without realizing that law is there, and we think that law is only well, sometimes it is, right? It is only a necessary evil, but in the class, our students will realize how our lives are suffused by law. If you remember in the discussion earlier, from marriage to the most mundane, sometimes most mundane of tasks, there can be a shadow of law there present.
Yeah, actually, sir, when you mentioned earlier about, the importance of discussing the relationship between text and context would really trigger our students to think about their exposure as well in terms of law, right, and the narratives that they are presented with. For example, definitely our students would be very much aware of the school policies, and perhaps in one way or another, they were, they were able to follow or uh, really disregard it and got punished by it. Perhaps we could also contextualize it in that way so we could gauge our students to the text. But here's my question po. Say for example, sir, I'm a literature teacher teaching a general education subject, just like say Philippine literature or world lit. You mentioned that we start with protest literature. But what if we cannot find a text under protest literature or a poem under protest literature? Like, can we begin by searching other genres like fiction? I was actually thinking of, although this is a humorous short story, but the text written by Carlos Bulosan, The Laughter of My Father, if you're familiar with that. Like, can we start that and perhaps deepen our critical discussion of those?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Absolutely. We can of course examine, right. There's a large trove of Philippine literature texts, and yes, by all means, from short stories, um, literatures written not only in English but also in Filipino or translated into English, regional literature. All of these need to be kumbaga, we need to look for these materials everywhere because this has not been done in the Philippines. If you check scholarship, there are lots of books, journal articles written about law and literature, but all of them focus on Western texts because Western universities, U.S. universities, for example, they had a head start, so to speak. In our case, and we are very thankful with this development toward interdisciplinarity because of CHED's AB Literature and Cultural Studies designs. Now we have this opportunity or venue to really explore and strengthen the field. Yeah, and yes, that now I realize, yes, that story by Carlos Bolosan would be perfect, di ba? Iba yung situation of the family and the rich family,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Tapos, parang, even though that's a humorous text, we could already see how
Right,
justice plays it for those who
right.
are privileged and those who are not. Parang the poor can and the marginalized can easily be subjected to accusations. And which is definitely a good way of enriching our discussion in terms of relating it to different, I think, social political issues, especially right now in our country. Um, Okay, one of our viewers said that teledrama texts are good materials for studies as well. And I believe so, no, in terms of heightening the perhaps the relevance and interest as well for students into being exposed to these kinds of texts. One question from our audience, from Mel Lucero. Are there standards or criteria of choosing a material or literary pieces to be used to in law and lit class?
Yeah, I'll just backtrack a little bit about the use of telenovelas, no, and well, pop culture texts. And yeah, in my class one text that I used was in fact an episode by The Walking Dead. The title of that episode is Judge, Jury, and Executioner. I think if you can check if you can check that episode, you'll see an interesting interplay of law in a post-legal society because well they are overrun by zombies, no? Anong mangyayari sa legal system natin? Everything probably will break down kapag merong mga zombies outside and the entire state, the entire society has broken down. So it's an interesting thought experiment if you think about it. Regarding the question, regarding standards, for me individually the only standard is if there is a legal theme or a legal dilemma that you can highlight in the discussion. That's it. That's for now the only standard that I have when choosing a text.
And by legal dilemma, sir, you mean the presence of injustice.
Yes, it can be that. The again, when I speak of law or when we treat law in this subject, it can be as broad as rules and regulations that govern our conduct, or it can be as formal as state law. Remember that state law is the most formal definition of law, diba? It's the law promulgated by Congress, so on and so forth. But in our class, it does not, for me, it does not need to be that. No? Hindi kailangan na this bill or that law, so on and so forth, or this constitution. It can be an understanding of how law functions. And yes, that includes our idea of justice, what is fair, so on and so forth. Natural law, di ba? The scholastics would tell us that we only have positive law because it is what is natural in the first place. So yeah, and they would say, that's why from natural law to divine law to positive law, it should be aligned. But in reality, that's not the case. Sometimes you have something that's legal is not necessarily moral. It's not necessarily right. No? And even that, parang tensions between one understanding of the law to another understanding of the law can be a subject of discussion. That can be a subject of discussion. So individually, that's how I choose. But another standard probably is the balance of the entire syllabus. And that's, I think, more challenging. It's easy to cherry pick. This one is nice. That one is nice. But if you check and look at did I cover the bases, all the bases that I think my students will learn from. Diba? And again, sometimes genre is important. Baka puro poems or baka naman puro fiction yung nandun. So I think we need to have a broad base. That's why we really need to look for materials, because we need to have a broad base, and that's the only time that we can effectively cherry pick those materials. Kasi kailangan balance din yung materials. If you have a design, kung meron kang idea of how do you imagine your course will be. Do I start with a general understanding of the law and then focus on state law later on in the course, so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you for that. In relation to what you mentioned about having a balanced law and literature curriculum in terms of exploration of the genres, a follow-up question from Cesar Obligado says, can literary form shape or inform a discussion so that using poems and novels would result in different learning experience?
Sorry, can you repeat that? So,
in literary form forms inform discussion so that using poems and novels would result in different learning experiences. So like pag poetry ba, mas madali ang reception learning, or pag fiction? I think this
right.
you were
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, again, I mentioned that the class is a literature class. No? So really the question of form is a big influence in the experience of the students in the discussion. So that's why I think the balance of the forms. You cannot have if the course promises law in poetry, that's okay. Na all texts are poems, but if it's a law in literature class, we need to provide them again a balance, so to speak, menu of the genres. No? And yes, I thank you for that question, and I understand the concern. Some students are more comfortable with certain forms or certain genres. And again, we need to deal with that. There are students, probably in some institutions, when you assign a novel, probably that's the only time that the student will be assigned a novel in his or her entire college life. Diba? So we need to, again, know our students. No? What are they prepared to take on, from lyric poems to excerpts. Sometimes we can do with excerpts if the text, for example, is too long. So excerpts of longer texts. But yes, I hope I answered that well in a general way, that yes, students or the forms affect the students' encounter with the text or with literature.
So just to be clear, because a while ago you mentioned the definition of literature as law, and then you mentioned that court cases can be used as text. If teachers get to be interested to acquire those copies, where can they get it? And would it be legal?
Yeah, that's another. I think that's another training, and it demands more for literature teachers to do law as literature, because you are not dealing with literature per se, but literature and cultural studies. No? For example, constitutions. Diba? Can I study a constitution as a cultural text? That's my dissertation project, or constitution making as a cultural text. No? Knowing that a constitution, for example, embodies the beliefs, the aspirations of the people. Another example would be, do you remember that debate on yung this Torre de Manila case? Do you remember that Torre de Manila case na parang ano yung pambansang photo bomber, di ba? Of nung Luneta na you can, because of the Torre de Manila, you cannot parang take a selfie in Rizal Park with the monument of Jose Rizal without that eyesore, no? And the court parang it's interesting yung debates in court because I think in the end it became a question of definition. How would you define what's the yung cultural, how would you define culture, no? Is it only the place itself or is it the vista, di ba? Kasi if you say na it's also the vista of Rizal Park, Torre de Manila, ang layo-layo na. It's not touching Rizal Park anymore. But would you say that the vista of Rizal Park, no, is Rizal Park is affected, the monument and what it represents, so on and so forth, is affected because of that Torre de Manila. So, pero yun nga, if there are, well, shout out to Duke Bagulaya, who's a literature teacher and also a lawyer. And probably there are other literature teachers who are taking up law, and probably that's your, that would be your field. That would be your field. Also a very interesting course if that gets developed. But for us, for the yung mga hoi polloi literature teachers, I suggest na we start with something that's not daunting, that's within our scope, and that's why yung law in literature.
Thank you for that. Last question, sir. I appreciate that you mentioned that the term canon actually has baggage, right? And it's not an easy feat to really establish the idea of having a canonical text under law and literature when even the discussion on national literature, say for example, for the Philippines, is being contested on. And you mentioned a while ago that we're actually past that stage, although I believe there are still literary scholars who are debating on it. If, say, for example, we are to, let's just in a way theorize. Now, say, for example, if there are a group of literature teachers who would like to venture on this, like law and lit, what do you think would be the direction of this discipline?
That's a difficult question. The number one, I think yun nga, canon formation has been in question for a long time, but we need to go back. What has been, diba, the function of the canon, and diba, during that time of canon formation, so on and so forth, it was helpful, no? It was something that helped scholars, no, para merong intersection, so that there's an intersection regarding our scholarly efforts, our teacherly efforts, so that we can compare notes. And I think when a field is as young as law and lit in the Philippines, I think it would be helpful. But in 5 years from now, we cannot be stuck to an idea of a canon or the canon of law and lit in the Philippines. Of course, that has to be eventually be destroyed, be made and remade. No? But we're not yet on the near future. We need the effort, no, and the help of who are familiar with the different actions that they probably are already teaching in their classes, so on
And
and
who
so
are
forth.
also good in archival work.
Right. So we need right now, we need scholars and archivists di ba, for law and lit.
Oh, well, just a big, no, sir. Thank you so much for answering all of the questions. I'd like to share the comments from our viewers. By Lulu Ignacio, would just like to share my thoughts about the short story, Leo Tolstoy's God Sees the Truth But Waits. I believe it's a text also taught in word literature even for junior high school. Uh, the story laments the fate of the main character, Ivan Aksionov, who has been falsely accused of a crime. And we know the rest of the story. Ultimately, Ivan gets vindicated but chooses to stay in prison because he has significantly touched lives of his inmates by being regarded as their spiritual father in their time of both physical and emotional incarceration. So very good. Like you were able to think of other texts, that perhaps you were able to teach before, which can be definitely classified to be a text for law and lit. And the other one, Eugene Noble, law and lit may serve as a subject for pre-law courses to help students who want to pursue law after college and also as a bridging subject for those who want to take law without a legal background. Truly, the research of Sir Sollano is a very commendable endeavor. Thank you so much, audience, for being participative. Um, Once again, thank you for your very informative lecture, Sir Sollano. Surely our co-teachers in the literature field have found another set of insights that can enhance our students' classroom experience. The class and UNITAS team would like to present you the certificate. Let me read the citation. Class Incorporated General Assembly, co-sponsored by UNITAS. Certificate of Appreciation to Mr. Francis C. Sollano, MA, for sharing his knowledge and expertise as the speaker of class lecture series titled Teaching Law and Literature, Poetic Encounters with Law, conducted online on July 8, 2022, signed by Professor Maria Luisa D. Reyes, PhD, Editor-in-Chief of UNITAS, and President of the Cultural Literary Art Studies Society, Incorporated. Okay. Okay, for our audience, please be reminded to access the Google Drive link provided by Sir Sollano. It was posted in the comment section. This contains the materials related to today's lecture. The class would like to thank the viewers who have been asking interesting questions, contributing to the discussions with their remarks, or even for just having been there, quietly listening, watching, and taking down notes about the lecture, as some of them have indicated to us. Please tune in to the fourth installment of the class lecture series to be delivered online on July 15th, Friday, 3 p.m. So please wait for the PubMat to be posted on the Facebook page of class and UNITAS, and follow our Facebook pages too. Again, this is Honey Alerta, and thank you so much for choosing to spend your Friday afternoon with us, and good afternoon.